being here today. We're really happy to have you all. We are happy to have Jim Cushlan and Kirsten Hines introducing their books, The Biscayne National Park and their award-winning Key Biscayne, and they're going to talk to us about a history of Biscayne Bay. We're doing this in conjunction with the Key Biscayne Community Foundation, the Key Biscayne Citizen Science Project, the Historical Society, and the Village of Key Biscayne. We also want to acknowledge a few special guests, former Mayor and Council Member Frank Kaplan, former Council Member Pat Woodson, and David Lawrence and his wife Roberta. We're very happy to have them here with us today. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Jim.
We very much appreciate not only you being here, but our sponsorship. Mayor Kaplan, he's the one to ask at the end, and he's going to tell you, because these are the folks who are preserving our culture and heritage on Key Biscayne. Joan, in the back, I hope everybody knows Joan. There's two books on the history of Key Biscayne. Ours, which is based on images, and Joan's, which is based on journalism. And you need to have both of them. So, Joan, thank you so much for coming. These two books, as Kirsten will explain, kind of go together. Together they tell the history of the Bay, from where we are down to the south. And we hope you enjoy this exploration into history, and we hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thank you all for being here. These two books have been linked from the beginning, and really, truly, they've been linked in the sense that the last chapter of the Key Biscayne book is about Bill Baggs and about Biscayne National Park to the south. And as we were working on this book, with this series, you can't tell the story if you don't have a picture. So I actually called Biscayne National Park and I said, you know, I'm working on this book and I need this picture. It's on your website. Can you help me find it? And they said, well, the guy who can help you is actually on vacation right now. I went, oh, great. So he didn't get back to me in time, but when he did get back to me, after we had already submitted all the materials for the Key Biscayne book, he said, you know, I'm working on the committee planning the 50th anniversary celebrations for Biscayne National Park, which happens to be in 2018. And he said, I really want to have one of those yellow history books for Biscayne National Park. Could you do that for us? And I was like, well, you know, yeah, we just finished it and it was fun and I learned so much and yeah, that would be great. So long story short, the publisher was so excited about this idea and the idea of really not just celebrating the history of Biscayne National Park, but also celebrating the park as it is today. And I am also a photographer, and so they said, you know what, why don't we just do a one-off where we'll let you do all the way from history, so we start with the Paleo Indians in that book, and go all the way through to the final third of the book is a chapter on Biscayne National Park as it is today, to celebrate Biscayne National Park for 2018, which is its 50th birthday. So, that's how these are linked, and so today this talk is going to be a little unusual. The ones I've been giving recently have been all about Biscayne National Park, and today I'm going to try and infuse a little more of Key Biscayne and connect to the history. As Jim said, though, it will really be central down to the southern Biscayne Bay, and they're very connected. So the thing about Biscayne Bay is throughout human history, it's actually been relatively isolated. And these pictures were all taken last year on one very calm morning, which was actually really full of no-see-ums. Looks really peaceful, but I was scratching a lot. You can look out, and despite the fact that you're standing in one of the most densely populated counties in the entire nation, you can look out there and feel like you're still in the wilderness. And that is the beauty of Biscayne Bay, and it wouldn't be that way today if it hadn't been for the fact that a lot of people put a lot of effort into keeping it that way. But all throughout history, it's been isolated. And even when there were few people here, you still felt like it was in the middle of nowhere. And the beauty of it is it's still that way. So it's a very special place, and part of what makes it so special is that it's a tropical lagoon attached to a temperate continent. So there are species here in Biscayne Bay that you will find nowhere else within the continental US. So mangrove cuckoo, coral reefs, parrotfish, manatees, American crocodiles, these are all tropical species that really don't go anywhere else. And if we hadn't protected Biscayne Bay, these might not be here, and the bay wouldn't be what it is today. And yes, that is me with an American crocodile. I am a herpetologist by training, so I've studied reptiles in the past, and even though I've transitioned to writing and photography, I just, you can't get it out of your system. So occasionally I go volunteer on other people's projects, and this one was at Turkey Point working on the endangered crocodiles there. So the first people who actually lived on Biscayne Bay were the Glades culture people. And they were actually based on the Miami River, and this, what you see up here, is the excavation from just a couple of years ago, really, what's called the Royal Palm Circle, and this is on the north bank of Miami River, and this was where they lived. You probably heard about the Miami Circle. That was ceremonial, but people didn't live there. And people didn't live on Key Biscayne at the time either. They might have, there's some evidence now that they might have lived on some of the islands within Biscayne National Park, but this would have definitely been a place where they were living. And they would have used the islands, like Key Biscayne and those in Biscayne National Park, seasonally. They would canoe out there, and they would hunt, and they would gather. And there's evidence that they were doing that. These shell tools that are from History Miami, they actually came from Key Biscayne. And the shards of pottery that you see over there came from the islands within Biscayne National Park. So we know that they were here, we know that they used the islands, but they really were living on the mainland. And so Biscayne Bay, even back when, started off as a boating place. And when the Spanish arrived, Juan Ponce de Leon came in 1513, he named those people the Tequestas. And as you can see on this map, which actually is a little bit confusing, but the second stop within North America was on Key Biscayne. So Key Biscayne was Juan Ponce de Leon's second encounter with North America. And for the next couple centuries, the Spanish ruled. And they didn't settle the area. They just boated through, kind of like the Tequestas. They canoed through. The Spanish just passed through on their way between Havana and St. Augustine, which was the trade route at the time. And one of the pieces of evidence we have of that is this Madonna that was washed up, probably from a shipwreck, and was found by Virginia Tannehill, who lived on Elliott Key. She was famous as a beachcomber, and she found this in the mangroves. So there's evidence of Spanish from all of these shipwrecks and what has been left, but they really didn't live in the area at the time. So it was a maritime community, even when it started, from the Indians to the Spanish, to the next set of settlers, and this is actually one of the very early regattas in Biscayne that was founded by Ralph Monroe from Coconut Grove. And today it is still a boating community. So you go out there now and you'll see all different types of boats and lots of boating-based activities, and it really is the best way to explore and appreciate Biscayne Bay. And people didn't really start settling here until after 1821, when Spain returned Florida, or gave Florida to the United States. And at that point, the US government started securing the borders and lighting the reefs, and the Key Biscayne lighthouse was one of those lighthouses. And that was built in 1825 to secure the area, and it remains the oldest, still standing in the same location, building in all of Dade County. So it was a very, very important building, and it was the beginning of settlement in the area. Unfortunately, there was an Indian attack in 1836 on the lighthouse, and that pretty much scared all the settlers away. So it went from just starting to be settled to being evacuated almost immediately. And this was the beginning of the Second Seminole War arriving to Biscayne Bay, and from there it moved further south into the Keys. And at that point, military took over the lighthouse area, and they called it Fort Dallas, and it was an encampment that they used to protect the area. And they continued protecting from there intermittently until 1842. Now, after this, around this time, the U.S. government, the Coast Guard, was intent on helping ships, because there had been shipwrecks, and they, especially in this area with all the reefs, it was quite dangerous. So Alexander Baki, who was the grandson of Benjamin Franklin, incidentally, he was tasked as the lead scientist to do a very detailed mapping here, and everything needed to be really, really precise. So he put down 2 baseline markers that he triangulated from to map everything within Biscayne Bay. And that all started right here on Key Biscayne. There were 2 markers. One of them was in the north, one of them was in the south. The one in the south actually eroded into the ocean, but it was rediscovered in the 1980s, so now you can still see both of those markers. One of them is at the lighthouse, and one of them is in the Crandon golf course. So they're still here, and it's evidence of this period of really intense mapping. And at that time, Bakke was more interested also in the reefs themselves, not just mapping them, but studying them. And so he brought on the scientist Louis Agassiz, whose legacy actually still lives on at University of Miami with the Rosenstiel Marine School on Virginia Key. And he was actually, part of why they wanted him to look at this was because they were hoping he would figure out how to control the reefs so that they wouldn't grow and hurt ships. But after he studied it, he very wisely suggested, you know, this is a really incredible system here, and maybe we shouldn't be trying to control that system. Maybe we should just light the reef correctly so that boats don't hit it. So unfortunately, the Cape Florida Lighthouse was not very effective at saving boats because it was inside the reef, and so some boats actually even crashed on the reef as they were trying to see the light. So in 1878, a lighthouse was actually put directly on the reef, and this is the Fowey Rocks Lighthouse that was far more effective in protecting ships. And that is still there today. You can see from this picture on a very, very stormy morning, the sun was rising. It's still there. It's part of Biscayne National Park at the moment, and it is still one of the favorite spots of seabirds to roost. And so it's a very good place to see these offshore seabirds that you wouldn't necessarily see on the mainland or even on the islands here. So you can see things like brown boobies if you go out to the lighthouse now. And it is still lit. It is still protecting ships from the reefs. So settlement really started after Fowey because Civil War was done. There was lots of time to, people were really coming to the area more at that point. Now, Key Biscayne, interestingly, the first landowners came from a Spanish land grant. So they dated back before the lighthouse. And both of them, the original one was, there were only 3 land grants. Remember I said they don't really settle in the area. There were only 3 Spanish land grants. One of them was given to Pedro Fornells for Key Biscayne. And he eventually sold that to Marianne Davis, who made the very first real estate profit on Key Biscayne because she bought 175 acres for $100. She turned around and sold a couple of those acres to the government to put the lighthouse on for $225. So, see, she did pretty well with her profits. So these were the first people to own land on Key Biscayne, and this was from the Spanish era, and they were actually from the colonial capital of St. Augustine, but they never really lived here. They just came long enough to secure their land grant. So they don't really count as settlers. And in the further south islands that are down near Elliott Key, that area, they had a different story. Bahamian mariners were coming in and out all through Spanish rule, through the British rule, but when the U.S. secured the borders, there were a lot more restrictions on them. So they used to come and they would collect wood, they would fish, later they would also wreck, but once the U.S. got control, they wanted to restrict the borders, so they couldn't move as freely in and out as they used to. So a whole lot of Bahamians moved to Key West. And Key West at the time was a very, very powerful city. It was the most prosperous city in all of Florida. And so they moved there, partly because wrecking was part of their income. And at that point, they declared that they had to move to Key West to register, or they had to register anyway in Key West to be wreckers. So a lot of them just moved there. And it was a natural move for them because they already were very familiar with the islands. Key Biscayne is very different than the further south islands, because the further south islands are all limestone, and that's what you have a lot of in the Bahamas. So these people already knew how to farm on this limestone substrate. You can see some of the clearing here that was happening on Elliott Key. So it's pretty extensive. But first, they actually had moved to Key West, and at one point there was a huge colony of white Bahamians who gained the name Conchs, living on Key Vaca. And over time, as things secured and the lighthouse was here and it was a favorable place, they started moving up the Keys for new areas to farm, and eventually found themselves on Elliott Key and the surrounding islands in the southern Biscayne Bay. So they were the real first settlers that lived here, and most of them kept their strong ties to Key West. Some of them even had homes that they would spend part of the year in Key West and part of the year here. And this ship here, the first one is the Moccasin, which was a sailboat wrecking from the early days of wrecking. And the other one is actually one of the very last wrecks in the area, which was the Alicia, which was a steamship. And steamships actually were kind of the end of this very, very lucrative business because steamships had better power, better control. There were also at that time better maps and better lighting. So the wrecking industry started fizzling after steamships were introduced. Now, the first conch to move into the area was Joseph Albury, and he arrived in 1871. And he was very quickly followed by others. So you can see by this map here, you can't really read the names, but you can see there's a lot of little lines on the map and a lot of little names. By 1880s, there were 40 land claims on Elliott Key and the surrounding islands. So there were a lot of people here, and in fact, there were enough to support a Dade County school, and there was a church all on Elliott Key. So it was quite populated at that time. And again, these people knew the islands, they knew how to farm. The Sweetings were an example of a conch family who had maintained a house in Key West and lived on Elliott Key, and they were very, very successful. They had been farming in the Bahamas before, and they were able to have a homestead, multiple generations. For 50 years, they farmed the land on Elliott Key. So for the Biscayne National Park book, we decided, well, let's go find that homestead. 50 years, right? There should be some remnants of it. Not a lot. We walked a lot, and this was the most we could find, was this little piece of wall that's still there. And you can also see some palms that had been planted around the house. But most of that, 50 years of living on Elliott Key, there's almost no signs of it anymore. Now, the way that these pioneer settlers were surviving, economically, they were tied into Key West, like I said, and two of the big industries aside from wrecking was sea turtles and sponges. So there were hundreds of boats that were working both sides of the coast, catching green sea turtles for turtle meat, and sponges this was a huge industry. And like I said, Key West was like the hot town of the time. It was the most economically booming. So that's how they were making their money. And then of course they were also fishing to feed themselves, and you can see they had some pretty substantial lobsters back then. Unfortunately now, Biscayne Bay, you're hard-pressed to find one of these types of sponges, or green turtles for that matter, and lobsters are not that big anymore. Fortunately though, Biscayne National Park has a lobster sanctuary, and because of that we have a population of lobsters that has survived and in fact continues to support a commercial fishing industry in lobsters. So we still have that sort of kickback to the pioneer days today. Now on Key Biscayne, the first attempts at agriculture were done by two men, Osborne and Field, who were from New Jersey, and their incentive really was land claim. And that was a good way to do it. Even the conchs, part of why they were moving was because they could get land by farming it. So these guys had a boat, and they had what they were calling mobile crews to set up coconut plantations. And they planted, I think it was like 76,000 coconuts on Key Biscayne in the 1880s. 5 years later, they finally got their title to the land, and they came back, and marsh rabbits had eaten all of it. So, turns out it didn't work out for them anyway, because the Davis family still had title to that property, and so they were able to dispute the new claim. And these guys eventually gave up on farming altogether, but they had successfully claimed land in a lot of places, so they went into real estate instead. Now, one thing I do want you to know, remember I said that the islands, Key Biscayne versus the more southerly islands, are very different. Look at all of the sand there. Key Biscayne is a barrier island. It is a sand barrier island. So the habitat here is very, very different. So this was the first attempt at agriculture on Key Biscayne, and it didn't work out so well. The first successful agriculture was actually in the southern bay, in what is now Biscayne National Park on Elliott Key. And pineapples were the first main crop that succeeded in Biscayne Bay. And partly they had already been grown successfully on Key Largo, so they knew that that would work. And also they had discovered that they shipped really well to northern markets who were very excited to have tropical fruit. So this was an economically feasible thing. And like I said before, the conchs knew how to farm this land, and they did very well at it. And so they would grow the pineapples, and then they would ship them. Some of them would ship them down to Key West and sell them from there, and others actually owned their own boats and would take them directly into New York so that they could benefit from the direct sale themselves. Now in 1906, unfortunately, a big hurricane came and inundated all of those pineapple crops. And at that point, the crop switched from pineapples to limes. So limes became the main crop of the area at that point. Now I do want to point out this drawing here of growing pineapples. This was actually in a magazine article that was written by Kirk Monroe, who was a very, very famous author who was living in Coconut Grove at the time. And I also want to point out in this picture, you see number 2 over here is the supervisor with the big net, and that cloud is not a cloud, those are mosquitoes. This little worker down here has his smoke pot next to him, and he has his head net. And I'll tell you what, some things do not change. I was working for getting pictures for the Biscayne National Park book, and I tell you what, despite the fact that I had a bug jacket on, I came home several nights just swollen from all the bug bites. Now the one person who really, really connects Key Biscayne history to that of the islands more southerly in Biscayne Bay is Israel Lafayette Jones. And he was an example of a totally different kind of settler, too. He was an American, he came from North Carolina, he moved down to Coconut Grove, which was the major settlement of the area at the time. And he started working at Peacock Inn as a handyman. And there he met his wife, who was a Bahamian chef at the inn, named Moselle. And so they got married, and Ralph Monroe of the Barnacle in Coconut Grove was quite impressed by Jones's handyman abilities and also the fact that he had boat skills. And so he eventually recruited him to help build the Davis House on Key Biscayne, and then also to help caretake it over the years. So he came down, he started in the Grove, he came over to Key Biscayne, and eventually he was so successful he started managing other people's plantations for them. And in 1912 he was able to buy his own property on Porgy Key, which is just south of Elliott Key. So he built a family home in 1912, and then he also bought property on Old Rhodes Key and Totten Key, and those were where he had his lime plantations. And he ended up being one of the largest lime producers in the area. He was highly respected, he was a wealthy, very, very successful man, and in fact, he helped found what is now Florida Memorial College. So, very important person in the community. When he retired, he turned over his lime crops, or lime groves, to his son, Lancelot Jones, who lived in the park and was one of only 2 people who got life residency after the Biscayne National Park was established. And this picture's from the 1970s. You can see him sitting on the family dock. And this is what remains of the house. The Joneses were on that site for almost 100 years. And this is all that's there now. Lancelot stayed there until, like I said, Hurricane Andrew, and then he evacuated. He wasn't living at this house anymore. There had already been a fire which had taken part of this out, but he was still living on Porgy Key. But after Hurricane Andrew, he evacuated, and he never made it back to the island. And signs of agriculture from this era are also minimal. So this is Totten Key, where they had their groves, and it's very, very hard to see any limes or anything. There's some out there. We went searching and found this sapodilla tree, which is a tropical tree that has kind of just blended into the hammock there. If you look at the base, there's 2 glass jugs there, and I figured that must have been there from the settlers. I certainly didn't put it there, so I was like, this is going to be the one I take a picture of, because it's got to kick back to the agricultural days. Now on Key Biscayne, agriculture happens again when the Mathesons bought the property. And so they owned a big part of the island at this point, and they started with Tahitian limes, which actually didn't sell very well. But they had success with coconuts, and they would sell the coconuts themselves, the fruits, to tourists. They couldn't compete with the bigger market, but they could sell to tourists, and so there was a very healthy local market. And they also were selling the actual trees for landscaping. They also sold houseplants for northern markets. And they had all kinds of other products, including one thing they were famous for was hacienda honey, which was something that they had here. And this actually is the packing plant where they would ship things like the honey and send it off for the market. And this is actually a canal that has now been filled in and is a roundabout in front of the yacht club. But this was just one of the few things that the Mathesons were doing. They had started this big plantation that they intended to be a money-producing plantation, but it was also an experimental tropical plant introduction station, and he had many other projects that he had going on. But this was the first agriculture on the Key that succeeded. Now in 1895, there were 9 registered residents on the Miami River. Miami was not a big city. But in 1896, everything changed for Miami and everything changed for Biscayne Bay community. And that is because that is the year that Flagler's Hotel, the Royal Palm, and his train both arrived in Miami that same year. And things just boomed after that. And then the train also made it to Key West in 1912. So suddenly the ties, you can see actually from this train, it says First Garf, Florida Pineapples by A.A. Atchison, Elliott's Key. So initially, people were still shipping down to Key West, but as Miami grew, and it wasn't so economic necessarily to ship your stuff to Key West and then train it out, ties faded with Key West at that point and become stronger with Miami. And then, of course, as Miami continued to become a hotspot, it attracted a whole new set of settlers that began to move into the Biscayne Bay area. And these were very wealthy, influential people. So another wave of a totally different type of settler in the Biscayne Bay area. They went from fishing and agriculture at that point to entertainment. And the first hotel was the Soldier Key Club. And this was actually built by Flagler to entertain guests of the Royal Palm Hotel. And he would ship them out for the day or maybe a couple days. You can see they're all standing on the dock looking down. That's because there were fish crawls there. They had a full staff. And even the locals would come up occasionally. This picture here is of the Peacock family of the Peacock Inn, which was the only hotel before the Royal Palm arrived in Coconut Grove. And they're here, and you see this little girl actually standing behind the skirts there. That was Eunice Peacock, who eventually married George Merrick, who of course designed Coral Gables. And here on Key Biscayne, at that point, the Mathesons also were using the island as an entertaining place. So in addition to having agriculture, they built this magnificent house. At that point, it was on the southwest corner of Key Biscayne. Now it's called Mashta Point. And it was in this glorious Moorish style. It was very ornate on the inside and the outside. It was meant to look like it was floating on the water. Beautiful, but apparently only for entertainment. Nobody ever slept there, by all accounts. And further down the bay, Mark Honeywell, who invented the thermostat, also had his entertaining venue out there. He built in the 1930s Boca Chica Key, including this lighthouse, which was one of the most iconic images, but the only remaining buildings of that era that really represents the kind of wealth that was happening at that time. And at that time, there were really a lot of influential people in Biscayne Bay. Presidents were coming to fish here, all kinds of politicians of other levels were here, senators, congressmen, industry leaders, the people who were really influencing the country were here. And it's hard to imagine one event that would kind of be bigger and more spectacular than everything else with that kind of people regulating the area. But I would wager that this event would be it, if there was one. And this was, Honeywell actually lived, his main house was on Miami Beach. So he was a member of Miami Beach's Committee of 100, which was supposed to be the wealthiest, most influential people in the nation. And he hosted their boating, what did they call it, the Southern Boating Day in 1941. And so everybody raced from Miami Beach to Boca Chica Key. He greeted them with a cannon blasts, and they had a show with water nymphs dancing on the boats when they got there. They had a huge carnival set up, and in each booth, they had a theme to raise money for charity. So this was a very, very big event, and very representative of the type of thing that was happening in Biscayne Bay in this time. And of course, coming back up north a little bit, in Stiltsville, the party was crazy, out of control. Miami actually had been dry for most of its existence. Julia Tuttle and the Brickles, they were against alcohol, and so they had put it in all of the original deeds that there was no alcohol allowed. There was a brief hiatus But by the time Prohibition, they voted themselves dry again long before national Prohibition happens. And so by the time Prohibition happens, people in Miami were really over it because it had become rum smugglers were all over the place. They were using the islands in the Biscayne Bay to hide. There were out and out gun wars. I mean, this was like cocaine cowboys of the 1920s and 30s, right? Except it was rum that they were dealing in. So it was a very violent time, and even in Miami, people were just flagrantly disobeying the law at this point because they were like, forget it. Like, let's just stay alive, right? Let's just drink, let's just be happy. So the party was crazy in Miami, and out of city limits in Stiltsville, it was even more so. And the debauchery just kept going after Prohibition officially ended. So this party just kept going. It was made famous by a Life magazine article that touted Stiltsville as the place to be if you wanted to party. Which is a little hard to imagine now because it is one of the most serene and tranquil places to go watch sunset. At its peak, there were 30 houses there. After Hurricane Andrew, only 7 remain. And it's a beautiful, serene entryway to Biscayne National Park, and you can see it from Bill Baggs. If you look south, you can see the houses, and it really is a very pretty setting now. And on a more wholesome note, on Key Biscayne, it was much more family-oriented developments that were happening. In 1947, the Rickenbacker Causeway opened. The Mathesons had donated Crandon Park, land for Crandon Park. This is actually Jim, my co-author, as a little kid by the train in Crandon Park. I had to convince him to let me put this in the show. So Crandon Park opened, and the Mathesons also sold land to the Mackles for a development that was really to attract families to the area, and it was meant to be housing that veterans could afford. And it was a planned community, and it is what is now the Village of Key Biscayne. Now, of course, development had already begun long before all of this in the North Bay, and by this point, it was had been developed to its max for a long time already. Central, Key Biscayne was kind of kicking off the development when it opened in 1947, but it was just kind of starting. And the Southern Bay hadn't been developed at all yet. And so developers started thinking, wow, what a great opportunity. We have the south ends of Key Biscayne is still open, and why don't we just build this causeway and go all the way down to Key Largo? And we'll just, where we need, we'll dredge, we'll fill, we'll build islands. It's just going to be this spectacular, Miami Beach style development all the way down to Key Largo. Now, if that had happened, we would have a very, very different bay today. But this started concerning environmentalists, and there were other things concerning environmentalists at the time. Between Key Biscayne and Key Largo, there were about 200 landowners at that time on the islands around Elliott Key and through the bay. Most of them did not live there, but there were structures. There was the Ledbury Lodge, there were private clubs, so there was hotels, clubs, there were homes. But most of them were people like the Norts who lived full-time in Coconut Grove, and they used this as a weekend and holiday home. And there were only 2 full-time residents in Elliott Key area at the time. One of them was Virginia Tannehill, who found that Madonna I showed at the beginning, and the other one was Lancelot Jones, who you saw sitting on the deck. So those were the only 2 people that actually lived full-time on the island. Everybody else mostly just owned their little piece. And a few of those landowners were really excited about this idea of this causeway coming through and all the money they might make if they could sell their property for Miami Beach-style development. So 13 of those landowners floated a voting booth over to Elliott Key and voted to incorporate. And so the city of Islandia was formed in 1960. And aside from these big causeway plans, there was also other large-scale development that were specifically looking at the Southern Bay. There was a rocket engine experimental fuel facility that was experimental at building and creating. There was a nuclear plant facility, and then there was also a proposal for a deep port and oil refinery station. So these were major proposals that were on, as well as the causeways, all the various causeways. Now, one of the first to be completed And one of the first to be fuel for the fire in terms of environmental concerns was Turkey Point. When it first came online, its discharge waters went straight out into the bay, and these were very hot waters, and they killed huge areas of seagrass beds, which of course was very concerning to people who were looking at these other development plans thinking, what's going to happen to our bay if all of this happens? In the end, Turkey Point was able to put in cooling canals, which have actually contributed to the downlisting of the American crocodile from endangered to vulnerable. So there has been some pluses, and they did take care of the problem. Of course, there's lots of other problems. But nonetheless, this was something that ended up being a rallying cry to help protect the rest of the bay. And as environmental groups had success and were moving forward, people who were thinking about Islandia got really nervous, and they were like, oh no, what's going to happen to all this money I was going to make? And so they floated a bulldozer out to Elliott Key and went straight down. There had been a little road down the middle already, but they took this thing and made it into this huge scar straight down Elliott Key, all the way down the middle. And this was called Spite Highway because it happened literally days before Congress voted on whether this should be protected or not. And at that point, so many people had already fought so hard and done so much work, it was pretty sure it was going to become a park. And so this is why it got the name Spite Highway, because it was like, it's not going to change anything. Unfortunately, it did not. I don't have time to go through all of the stories of the environmentalists, and there were so many people that did so many amazing things. There were so many really cool stories about things that happened to protect it. If you really are interested in the history, on December 2nd, Jim will be hosting a history panel at the Biscayne National Park Visitor Center with some of the environmentalists, the movers and shakers who actually made this happen. So he's going to have people like Nathaniel Reed, who was at the Department of Interior at the time, Lloyd Miller, some of the people who really fought this battle. He will have them there to be interviewed. So you could go watch that. It'll be full moon, 6 to 8 p.m. It'll be beautiful. Or you could also read her book. But for now, what's important is that in the end, the environmentalists won, and not just in the national park, but also here on Key Biscayne. In 1967, Bill Baggs Cape Florida State Park was open to the public on New Year's Day. And in 1968, Biscayne National Monument protected what has become Biscayne National Park today. So in the end, we have the beautiful bay that we have today, and actually Key Biscayne itself, part of the beauty of it is that it didn't get fully developed. The north was developed to the max. Key Biscayne has this kind of in-between. You have Crandon Park and you have Bill Baggs State Park. So it's this nice balance of development and still maintaining greenery. And then in the end, Biscayne National Park is there for all of us in perpetuity, which is awesome. And so this is Spite Highway today. It is just a little hiking trail down Elliott Key, and to me it's a sign of healing that all of those people fought such hard battles in order to keep this paradise. And it really is a paradise, and you can go and hike down this road that had been a sign of such hatred at one point and appreciate now the beauty. So Biscayne Bay today is a place for plants. It's a place for wildlife. It's a place for fishing. That's my dog. It's a place for watching nature, and this is from the top of the Boca Chica Lighthouse on a Christmas bird count. It's a place for diving. It's a place for photography. It's a place for boating. It's a place to party. It's a place for a nap. It's a place to watch sunsets. This one's a moonrise. This was the King Moon Rising last year, so this is a place for moonrises. It's a place for sunsets. And it's the place for the dawning of new days. And I'd like to end by just reading the last caption from our new book, Biscayne National Park. In the midst of a winter sunrise, a boater ventures out into the bay from Convoy Point, heading to a place that is ancient and modern, accessible and remote, familiar and mystical. Biscayne Bay has seen as many changes as there are varied moods of dawn, but Biscayne National Park will always be a place for future generations to be enchanted by a tranquil sunrise. Thank you so much. And I'll make Jim grab a mic too if you have any questions. We can answer those at this time.
Built Stiltsville, and what is it today?
So it was built in the 1920s and 30s. There were lots of different people who did it. Like I said, there were 30 structures at the max. Some of them were just barges and boats that were banked on the sandbar. The first one was by a guy, what was his name? It was Crawfish Eddie, who sold bait and served lobster chowder. So there were lots of different people who had these, and some of them actually were just individuals who had it as a fishing camp. And then there were some that were like the Miami Springs Motorboat Club still has one today. They are officially owned by Biscayne National Park, but caretakers can still use them, and they do maintain them as well. So in fact, actually, I forgot I was supposed to tell you guys, thank you for this question, there was a lot of damage to Stiltsville from Hurricane Irma, and they're trying to raise funds because it is the responsibility of the caretakers to repair them. So if you are game, if you go to Stiltsville Trust, to their website, and you can make a donation to help maintain those 7 houses, because they did take a hit in the storm.
Are you a native Floridian?
I am not. I'm originally from Seattle. I moved here, I was appalled to discover the other day, 20 years ago, for graduate school. I was like, what? I'm not old? What? But my co-author, he moved here when he was 3. He's been here a long time. He's one of, I would say I think that's pretty native as far as those things go. To Miami even, not just Florida.
Why have the sea turtles not returned to Biscayne Bay?
So, I mean, I think partly just the population's crashed so much, and sea turtles, they are habitual. I mean, they go back to the same places and the same patterns. So if you've killed off an entire generation from an area, especially if the population isn't particularly large, they're not looking for new spaces, they're just kind of trying to hang on, and all sea turtles, of course, are endangered. So I suspect that's why they haven't returned, because their population has been low and there was generations lost from this area. So this would have been a place for the juveniles primarily.
Just because we happened to just have a lecture on sea turtles last month, and there are actually increasing numbers of nests along the east side of like Miami and Biscayne Bay. And so,
But those are loggerheads, right?
they're mostly loggerheads. I can't remember the other species that she mentioned, but she did mention one, I think 2 other species, and there were very, very few nests, but more than they've had than like in the past. So they're hoping that means that their numbers are increasing. But yes, there's still like a very, very low number. But I just wanted to say that there aren't 0.
Yeah. Oh no, there's not 0. But I think here primarily what we're getting, even with the increase in numbers, are loggerheads, and leatherbacks are the other one that their population is really increasing with the number of jellyfish everywhere. So I know they've been really excited about that number going up as well, because leatherback sea turtles in Florida have been really, really rare for a really long time. But I think green turtles, continue to be. I mean, I would be really excited if I hear. Okay, I was going to say, I'd be really excited to learn otherwise, but I think that they're still not really in the area.
Yeah, I can't remember, it was last month, but yeah, it was loggerheads, leatherbacks, and one other. It might have been one green or something. Was it green? Okay, several people were at that lecture too.
Oh,
But
great.
yeah, so
I'm glad to hear it.
Also, yeah.
I'm very glad to hear it.
But just think, these boats would go out and catch hundreds of turtles and take them to Key West. Or folks would go out on the beach and tip over hundreds of breeding turtles in a night, both for their eggs and for the turtles themselves. And they only hunted green turtles because those are the only ones that eat vegetation and they taste good. But just like the sponges, I mean, these were huge populations here in South Florida. And you just take them down to a certain level, and the recovery, if it happens, is going to take a long, long time. But we still have to protect our loggerheads out on our beaches.
I would also say that while it's mainly loggerheads here now, I personally had a green turtle that was tagged in Bermuda come through Haulover Inlet and establish site fidelity off of Elliott Key as a subadult that was looking for seagrass beds to forage in. So protect our seagrasses.
Yeah, that's great. I mean,
Yeah.
hopefully more and more come.
Yeah.
Happy to have them.
If you could mention maybe some of the notable families that lived along Biscayne Bay. I know we had Skye and Deering, all of those other people. Could you mention some of those?
When you get up into our area here, of course, it's the Deering and the Mathesons that were the most prominent. James Deering's Biscaya, and he also bought the southern end of Key Biscayne from the Davises, and he was the one who stabilized the lighthouse. His brother Charles bought Cutler, the whole town of Cutler, and established his residence there. Mathesons, of course, are tremendously important, lived in Coconut Grove, owned most of Key Biscayne, which they eventually sold off either to the Mackles or the second generation also participated in the development of Key Biscayne, like the Key Biscayne Hotel and the Jamaica Inn and so forth, were owned by the Mathesons themselves. So those, I think, are probably the two most important families that connect Miami to Key Biscayne. We talked about the Honeywells and so forth down in the lower end of the bay. But the interesting thing is, in this period of the 1920s and 30s, huge numbers of the most important people in the United States came to South Florida in the wintertime. And that committee of 100, the slide we showed of the party there, it wasn't the important people in Miami. It was the important people in all of the United States. So you had Firestones, you had all of the folks who lived in Palm Beach. When you look at the list of the people who came, you recognize all of the names of the great industrialists of the time. Now, we're not much talking about the Northern Bay, which was developed apart from the southern part of the bay. So I think those are the families that really have influenced this story. Do you have other people in mind?
The Kellogg's. Yeah, that's
Tell
a
us.
flaky bunch, though.
Tell us, other than the house where we turned at the boat.
Yeah, I think that there was something like an underground railroad, except it was across the water for blacks fleeing, and they went to the Bahamas. Can you talk a little bit about
Joan,
that?
you with us? Would you like to talk about the Underground Railroad for us?
Actually, that one picture of the canoe growing across the waves, that was an artist rendition of exactly that.
Everybody appreciated that picture and probably wondered what it was all about. 1821 is when an entire art group of hundreds, some people say thousands, of blacks came down from North Florida and from the Carolinas, and they rendezvoused on Key Biscayne at Cape Florida. And they rendezvoused because they're one of the earliest parts of the Underground Railroad. In other words, they did not go north to escape the slave catchers, but they came to the Cape because they had made arrangements between the Native Americans and others to meet on the Key Biscayne beach with captains of the sloops from the Bahama Islands. And they came over and they picked up this group of people and sailed them across to freedom in the Bahamas.
Thank you.
Again, thank you all for being here. We'll stick around if you have any questions or if you want to have a book. We'll be in the front.